Mark, who weighed 325 pounds, was struggling with his health, a concern that was magnified for Sarah, especially after she had lost close friends to heart attacks. Out of worry for his well-being, Sarah placed restrictions on their intimacy, limiting their encounters to just 4 times a year, each tied to specific weight loss milestones. These occasions aligned with Valentine's Day, their anniversary, and their respective birthdays. Over 2 years, Mark dedicated himself to this grueling journey and managed to shed an incredible amount of weight, bringing him down to 207 pounds. However, after losing 118 pounds, Mark found himself contemplating giving up. The road had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. When Mark shared his thoughts about quitting, Sarah's reaction was swift and unyielding. She flatly refused to let him stop, delivering a threat that would shake the very core of their marriage. If Mark abandoned the weight loss plan, she declared, he would only be allowed intimacy 4 times a year, and she hinted at seeking fulfillment elsewhere due to her unmet needs. In that moment, their relationship began to fracture. Mark's head snapped up in shock, his eyes searching hers with disbelief. His initial confusion quickly turned to sorrow as the weight of her words sank in. Sarah watched as his sadness transformed into anger, and then into a look of pure disgust. Instantly, she realized the enormity of her mistake. She had pushed the man she loved to his breaking point in pursuit of her own desires for his weight loss, only to weaponize the threat of infidelity against him when he faltered. Mark didn't hold back his frustration. He reminded Sarah of the monumental effort he had poured into losing over 100 pounds for her. His voice carried a mix of pain and disappointment as he accused her of using intimacy as a bargaining chip to control him. He expressed his dismay at the thought that his reward for such hard work was the threat of betrayal. Mark felt that Sarah had not only jeopardized their marriage but also introduced a chaos that made him question everything about their relationship. For the first time, he wondered if she had entertained thoughts of cheating during the 2-year journey they had endured together. Sarah tried to defend herself, insisting that she had never intended to follow through on her threat, but Mark couldn't bring himself to trust her words. With a look of disgust, he made it clear that the situation was far more serious than she seemed to understand. A few minutes later, Mark pushed back his chair, left the kitchen, and retreated to the garage, leaving Sarah at the table in tears. In the solitude of the garage, Mark busied himself with small tasks to keep his hands occupied while his mind raced through the implications of their argument. He didn't truly believe Sarah had cheated on him in the past, but now he wasn't certain anymore. Earlier that day, he would have confidently dismissed the idea, but after hearing her words, doubt began to creep in. The future felt even murkier. If she could say such a thing now, who was to say she wouldn't follow through later? As his thoughts spiraled, he muttered aloud, "I need to figure this out." Eventually, Mark walked back into the house. Sarah was still at the kitchen table, her face streaked with tears and her eyes red from crying. Seeing her in such a state tugged at Mark's emotions, but he remained resolute. He calmly told Sarah that he was done with the diet. If she insisted on continuing their limited intimacy schedule, he would abide by it, whether it meant 4 times a year or none at all. The choice was hers. However, he made one thing abundantly clear. If she ever sought intimacy with another man, there would be severe consequences. Mark didn't mince words, warning her that he would take action against any man who dared to be with her. His tone was firm as he laid down his boundaries. Infidelity, he said, would lead to the immediate dissolution of their marriage. He referred to her as a fancy woman, making it clear that he had no tolerance for betrayal. Mark admitted he no longer trusted her fully and warned her that he would be closely watching her behavior from now on. He ended the conversation by announcing that he needed some time alone. Grabbing his car keys from the counter, he walked out the back door, leaving Sarah to her thoughts. As the garage door opened and Mark's car pulled away, Sarah sat frozen at the table. She buried her face in her hands, whispering through her sobs, "Oh my God, what have I done? How could I be so foolish?" Her tears flowed freely as the weight of her mistake settled heavily on her shoulders. She wished desperately that she had chosen her words more carefully, but it was too late to take them back. Later, Sarah pulled herself up from the kitchen table, made her way to the bathroom, and then collapsed onto their bed, where she continued to cry softly. When Mark returned home that afternoon, he found her lying in the exact same position, her sorrow as palpable as it had been hours earlier. Like many husbands who suspect infidelity, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands and investigate. He figured the simplest place to start was by obtaining a detailed record of calls from their home phone and Sarah's cell phone. Since both accounts were in his name, he anticipated no trouble in accessing the data. At the landline provider's office, Mark was pleased to learn they could provide him with 3 years of call logs. He requested the full span to ensure he had records dating back to before Sarah had imposed the restrictions on their intimacy. For a small fee, the company transferred the data to a CD, and Mark left the office satisfied, clutching the information he sought. His next stop was the cell phone provider. Initially, they hesitated to release Sarah's call logs, given that the phone number was primarily hers. However, Mark pointed out that it was a shared account, with his name listed prominently on all records. With that, they agreed to provide the data in electronic format for $120. Though Mark thought the fee was steep, he decided it was worth the cost for the convenience. He did, however, make a mental note to consider switching providers in the future. By the time Mark arrived home, it was around 4 p.m. He found Sarah still lying on their bed, now sound asleep. Choosing not to disturb her, he headed straight to the home office, locking the door behind him to ensure privacy. He sat at the computer and uploaded the data from both CDs into a folder he had created in his documents. Mark had already devised a plan. He would start with the call logs from 2 years ago, specifically from September 2008, when Sarah had first set the limits on their closeness. Sorting through the home phone records, he discovered 96 calls to 19 different numbers that September alone. Using the format provided by the phone company, he organized the data into a detailed list that included the phone numbers, dates, times, and call durations. Once he had mastered the system, it took him about an hour and a half to process the entire 2 years of home phone records. Just as he was about to begin analyzing Sarah's cell phone logs, Mark heard the doorknob rattle. Since the office door was locked, no one could enter, but the interruption prompted him to save his work and carefully hide any evidence of his activity. After logging off the computer, he opened the door to find Sarah standing there. She looked utterly broken. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes and nose red from crying, and she was sniffling softly. She kept her head bowed, only glancing up at Mark reluctantly. Through trembling words, Sarah apologized, admitting the pain and anger she had caused him. She acknowledged her selfishness and cruelty, recognizing how her actions had interfered with his progress. She pleaded for his forgiveness, insisting that she hadn't fully grasped the harm she had done. Mark listened carefully but made it clear that his forgiveness was conditional. "I'll forgive you," he said, "but only based on what I know right now." He reminded Sarah of the sacrifices he had made during their 2-year journey, including abstaining from intimacy, all for her sake. But he also admitted he had reached his breaking point. "I can't keep doing this," he confessed. Turning the conversation to the heart of the issue, Mark addressed what he called the gorilla in the room. He explained that he needed absolute certainty about whether Sarah had ever cheated on him or planned to do so in the future. The lingering doubt, he said, would drive him insane. He outlined the conditions for their relationship moving forward. If Sarah had been faithful in the past and intended to remain so, they could work through this. However, he emphasized that rebuilding trust would take time and effort on her part. Mark held Sarah accountable for the chaos her thoughtless comment had unleashed. "You caused this mess," he told her bluntly. "Until I feel confident in us again, you'll have to deal with the fallout." Sarah had hoped Mark would simply forgive her and let the matter drop, but she realized now that wouldn't happen. As she nodded in resigned agreement, Sarah thought to herself, "I suppose I deserve this, but I wish it would all just go away." She turned and walked back to the bedroom, closing the door quietly behind her. Lying on the bed, she didn't sob this time, but silent tears streamed down her face, her expression etched with regret. A few minutes later, Mark opened the bedroom door and asked softly, "Do you want anything to eat?" Sarah shook her head and replied, "No, Mark, I'm not hungry." Without another word, Mark walked back out to his car. As the garage door opened and she heard his car pulling away, Sarah whispered to herself, "What have I done?" She buried her face in her hands, tears welling up again as the weight of her mistake pressed down on her. Mark drove off to a familiar spot called Grisham's, a place he and Sarah had visited many times for drinks and good food. The restaurant's menu was known for its excellent offerings, and tonight Mark decided to indulge. It had been 2 years since he'd allowed himself more than a couple of beers in a week or enjoyed the greasy satisfaction of a bacon cheeseburger. But tonight, despite the ache in his heart, he chose to set his worries aside, at least temporarily, and savor the meal he'd been craving. While he promised himself never to let his weight spiral out of control again, this night was an exception. Returning home after his indulgence, Mark went straight to the office to resume his investigation. Since he was already familiar with the process, compiling Sarah's cell phone call log went more smoothly, and he finished in half the time it had taken with the home phone data. When the analysis was complete, Mark reviewed the combined information. Over the past 2 years, there had been a total of 3,482 calls made to and from 45 different phone numbers. Organizing the data by phone number, Mark began to notice patterns. Unsurprisingly, there were nearly 300 calls to his own cell phone, about 200 to his parents, and a similar number to Sarah's parents. Calls to Sarah's sisters accounted for another large chunk, while calls to his brother John totaled about half as many. There were also calls to friends whose numbers Mark recognized and a handful of calls to unknown numbers. As he combed through the list, 2 numbers stood out, one with over 200 calls and another with more than 50. Additionally, several numbers had 30 or so calls scattered over 2 years, but these seemed likely to belong to businesses like salons or stores. Those didn't concern Mark. Instead, he zeroed in on the 2 most frequently dialed unknown numbers. To dig deeper, Mark sorted the calls to these numbers by day and time, and the results sent a chill down his spine. His suspicion turned to anger as he uncovered a troubling pattern. Every Wednesday at 10:55 a.m., without fail, a call was made to Mark's cell phone. This coincided perfectly with his weekly staff meeting, which began at 11 a.m. and typically lasted until mid-afternoon. Mark realized that the weeks without this call aligned with his vacations. What struck him most was what came next. At 11:05 a.m. every Wednesday, another call was placed to the first unknown number. The timing felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. Mark's suspicion deepened as he turned his attention to the second number. Calls to this number consistently occurred on Friday afternoons, once a month to be exact. These Fridays matched the days Mark played golf with his brother and friends, finishing around 5:30 p.m. and returning home before 6:30 p.m. Sarah always made a point of calling him just before he teed off to tell him she loved him and would be waiting for him at home. Now, those calls felt like part of a carefully crafted routine. Mark's thoughts raced. If Sarah was indeed having an affair, when had it started? Had it only begun after she limited their intimacy, or had it started earlier? Extending his search another year, he discovered calls to the same numbers 3 months before the restrictions began, less frequent but present nonetheless. The realization was devastating. Whatever was happening, it hadn't started recently. Mark now had 2 goals. Identify the people behind the numbers and decide how to confront the situation. Starting with the first number, Mark ran a reverse lookup. It was a cell phone number with no public listing. The second number, however, was listed under the name Tony Bali. Mark's stomach dropped. He knew exactly who Tony was, his personal trainer at the gym. Sarah had been the one to find Tony for him when he began his weight loss journey. Mark couldn't ignore the implications. Sarah had been calling Tony on the Fridays when he was out golfing. Feeling a mix of fury and determination, Mark added Tony's name and address to his spreadsheet, then decided he needed to clear his head before diving further into the investigation. He returned to Grisham's for a couple more beers, hoping the familiar atmosphere would give him space to think. As the dinner rush wound down, Mark approached Brenda, the attractive bartender he and Sarah had known for years. He explained his situation briefly, asking for her help to confirm whether the first number belonged to Tony. Mark asked Brenda to call the number, posing as a woman named Jennifer who had received Tony's name as a potential trainer. If the person on the other end confirmed their identity as Tony, Brenda would ask if he had availability for new clients. Brenda, intrigued and willing to help, dialed the number. She waited as the phone rang, then asked, "Is this Tony?" She explained that she was Jennifer, a woman who had been given his number at her hair salon as a recommendation for a personal trainer. If he had availability, she mentioned she'd be interested in stopping by the gym to discuss training options. During the call, Jennifer shared some personal details, mentioning she was 24 years old, stood 5 feet 5.5 inches tall, and weighed about 130 pounds. Although she felt a bit judged during the conversation, she admitted she could improve her fitness and overall happiness by working toward a goal weight of 115 pounds. When Tony complimented her, she thanked him politely and asked about his availability. Tony revealed that he had an opening due to a recent client dropping out, and Jennifer immediately expressed her interest. She told him she'd stop by the gym in a couple of days to discuss her fitness plan in person. After expressing her gratitude, she ended the call, looking forward to meeting him. Mark sat in awe of Brenda's quick thinking. Not only had she confirmed that the number belonged to Tony from the gym, but she also uncovered that Tony had a habit of flirting with his clients. Even more frustrating, she verified that the opening in his schedule was due to someone quitting, likely Mark himself. Mark suspected Sarah had already called Tony to warn him about the situation and advise him to be cautious. Despite the turmoil in his chest, Mark couldn't help but find humor in Brenda's playful demeanor. She had joked about her own weight during the call, but Mark thought she looked perfect as she was. Smiling, he told her, "You're too funny. You don't need to lose an ounce. You're stunning just the way you are. Stay away from Tony, though. Nobody could have a more perfect body than you, Brenda." Brenda's response was warm and playful. She grinned, calling Mark a kind sir, and returning the compliment. "You're a hunk, Mark. I don't know what's wrong with your wife if she's looking elsewhere," she added with a teasing tone. Mark smiled back, appreciating the ego boost but staying grounded. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been considered a hunk, he admitted. But that doesn't excuse her behavior. Mark thanked Brenda for her help and her kind words, expressing how much he appreciated her support. With a heavy heart, he told her it was time for him to head home, thanked her again, and left the bar. When Mark arrived home, it was already late, so he went straight to bed. Sliding under the covers, he glanced at Sarah, who was still asleep. The sight of her stirred a deep sense of loss and disappointment within him. He couldn't recall ever feeling this low in his life, but he was certain the worst was yet to come. As he settled in, Sarah stirred and whispered, "I love you, Mark." His only response was a non-committal grunt as he turned away from her, staring into the darkness. Sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake, his mind replaying the events of the day. At one point, he thought he heard Sarah sob quietly but decided not to address it. The next morning, Mark woke to find Sarah spooned against him, her body pressing into his back. She reached over, her touch signaling a desire for closeness. In a remorseful tone, she apologized for her earlier words and asked for intimacy. Mark, fighting his vulnerability, resisted the temptation. "We've already established boundaries," he said firmly, "and I need to get going this morning." He reminded her of the limits he had set and gently but resolutely told her not to try this again. After getting out of bed, Mark showered and left for work. Meanwhile, Sarah remained behind, muttering to herself about how she deserved the consequences of her actions and the emotional pain that followed. At work, Mark confided in his boss, giving a brief overview of the situation at home. Understanding the gravity of Mark's concerns, his boss offered his full support, even suggesting that Mark take some time off to deal with his suspicions. He also recommended a reputable electronics distributor that could help Mark with surveillance equipment. Grateful for the understanding and assistance, Mark thanked his boss and confirmed he'd take the next 3 days off to focus on resolving the issue. When Mark visited the electronics distributor, he discovered his boss had already called ahead to ensure he received whatever he needed. After discussing his requirements, Mark purchased 3 high-quality bugs with long-lasting battery life and a range sufficient to transmit data to a receiver within a few city blocks. Although visual evidence seemed daunting to collect, Mark felt confident that audio recordings would suffice for now. That evening, Mark returned home to find Sarah had prepared a special dinner, his favorite lasagna with garlic bread and sweet green peas. He thanked her for the thoughtful gesture but excused himself to watch television after eating. Sarah quietly cleaned the kitchen and joined him in the living room, careful not to intrude on his space. Later, as Sarah headed to bed, Mark took the opportunity to plant one of the bugs on their home phone, ensuring that every conversation on the line would be recorded. Feeling nervous but determined, Mark then moved on to Sarah's cell phone. Though the act of bugging her phone felt invasive, he reminded himself that he needed the truth. In just a few minutes, the task was complete. Now, with both phones tapped, Mark had access to any conversation Sarah might have. The next challenge loomed in Mark's mind: how to plant a bug on Tony's phone. While he already had Sarah's devices covered, the thought of her possibly using a different phone or contacting Tony directly made him anxious. Mark considered the possibility that Sarah might resort to using a payphone or some other method to contact Tony, but he decided to focus on bugging Tony's phone directly. He remembered that Tony often worked closely with a striking, athletic blonde woman on Wednesday mornings. Mark suspected their interactions might keep Tony distracted enough for him to act. He figured this was his chance. At the gym, Mark spotted Tony's phone resting on a towel near the equipment Tony was using with the blonde. It was around 10:50 a.m., and Mark knew the timing was critical. Taking a deep breath, he thought, "What do I have to lose?" He slipped into the gym unnoticed, grabbed Tony's phone, and quickly backed out, heading straight to the men's room. There, with practiced ease, he inserted the bug into Tony's phone. The real challenge came next, returning the phone without raising suspicion. When Mark returned to the gym floor, he saw Tony wrapping up his session with the blonde. Getting close enough to replace the phone on the towel seemed impossible without being spotted. Frustrated, Mark muttered to himself, "How am I going to pull this off?" After a moment, he came up with a risky plan. He would slide the phone across the floor toward the towel, hoping it would land close enough to avoid suspicion. The attempt was nerve-wracking. The phone made a faint noise as it slid, but Tony, engrossed in his conversation with the blonde, didn't notice. To Mark's relief, the phone skidded perfectly, landing under the towel without a hitch. Confident that Tony would be none the wiser, Mark swiftly exited the gym. At exactly 10:55 a.m., as if on cue, Mark's cell phone rang. It was Sarah calling to touch base before his supposed meeting. Of course, she had no idea that Mark had taken time off work that week, let alone that he was monitoring her. Keeping his tone neutral, Mark ended the brief conversation and then turned his attention to the bug's receiver in his car. Moments later, Tony's phone rang. Tony answered cheerfully, and Mark's stomach churned as he listened to the conversation. Sarah's voice was cautious but clear. She told Tony that Mark was growing suspicious and suggested they pause their meetings for a while to avoid trouble. Tony grumbled, clearly displeased, but Sarah acknowledged the risk. She admitted that from their first intimate encounter, she'd known she'd do anything to be with Tony. Cutting Mark off, she confessed, had been a way to enjoy her time with Tony more fully. Mark clenched his fists as Sarah continued, mentioning that while she loved Tony, she couldn't risk discovery. She suggested they might resume their weekly meetings in a few weeks and, in the meantime, Tony could occupy himself with his other girlfriends. She even laughed, adding that she wasn't jealous of his other relationships. However, she proposed the possibility of meeting on the Fridays Mark went golfing, promising to let him know if it could work. Listening to Sarah's words, Mark felt his heart shatter further. The revelations made him sick with anger and grief. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the cold calculation behind it. Sarah's actions revealed a level of selfishness that Mark struggled to comprehend. He couldn't reconcile her claim of love with her behavior. Worse, he realized she'd used his weight loss journey as an excuse to fuel her encounters with Tony for over 2.5 years. She had even started meeting Tony 3 months before she imposed their restrictions. Determined to take action, Mark spent the next 2 days devising a plan. He made contacts and set the stage for the weekend, using the phone taps to gather more information. On Thursday, he overheard Sarah talking to her beautician, Janine, about an appointment for Friday morning. Sarah mentioned wanting a fresh, closey hairstyle to distract Mark from his suspicions. She also planned to buy provocative lingerie to further divert his attention. When asked about Tony, Sarah admitted she might temporarily reduce their meetings but laughed, assuring Janine it wouldn't be a permanent change. Mark felt a fresh wave of devastation but buried it under a growing fire of anger. He listened as Tony called Sarah on Friday, proposing an immediate rendezvous. Sarah expressed her desire but hesitated, citing the risk. She assured Tony that they could resume once Mark's suspicions subsided. By Saturday, Mark had set his plan in motion. After lunch, the doorbell rang, and Sarah opened it to find Brenda, the bartender from Grisham's. Brenda introduced herself as a friend of Mark's and mentioned that he had invited her to spend time by the pool. Sarah, caught off guard, reluctantly agreed and led Brenda to the backyard. Shortly after, 2 more women arrived. Sally, who had worked with Mark for years, and Linda, who often served them at Grisham's. Both women said Mark had invited them to use the pool. The presence of 3 attractive women unsettled Sarah. She began to wonder what Mark was up to. The women, unfazed, lounged on chairs, chatting and applying sunscreen to one another. Before long, they decided to tie the strings on their bikini tops and drop them onto their towels, opting for an all-over tan. Sarah, furious and embarrassed, wanted to confront them and demand they leave. However, knowing that Mark had invited them, she felt trapped. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's actions were deliberate. By 3:30 p.m., Brenda decided to approach Sarah, pulling up a chair beside her by the pool. With a calm but firm tone, Brenda introduced herself as a bartender at Grisham's and disclosed that Mark had stopped by for drinks the same night Sarah had issued her ultimatum. She revealed that Mark had shared the details of their situation, leaving nothing out. Sarah's expression shifted to one of shock, and Brenda took the opportunity to voice her belief that Sarah had made a serious mistake. Brenda leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but not her intensity. "Mark's suspicious now," she said, her eyes narrowing. "He's actively investigating, and he told me to warn you. If he discovers any infidelity, past or future, he plans to get carnal with me, Sally, and Linda for each instance." Sarah's jaw dropped as she tried to respond, but Brenda cut her off. "Oh, and if you lie to him when he questions you, he's decided that's another reason to get carnal with one of us." Brenda smirked, adding a hint of mischief. "For what it's worth, we're fine with it. Mark's attractive, and we're not exactly turning down the idea." Sarah sat in stunned silence as Brenda's words sank in. Brenda, clearly aware of Sarah's past actions, anticipated that Sarah might attempt to lie to cover her tracks, which would only result in Mark spending more time with them. Her tone was casual but carried an unmistakable edge, leaving Sarah reeling. Just then, Sally joined them, pulling up another chair. "You know, I've worked with Mark for years," Sally began with a warm smile. "Even when he'd gained weight, I always thought he was a sweetheart. Losing the weight, that just made him even more appealing." Sally admitted she'd harbored a crush on Mark for a long time, and now that he was single, or soon to be, she wasn't shy about expressing her interest. "He could have me any time he wanted," she added, her tone equal parts playful and serious. Linda wasn't far behind. Taking a seat, she chimed in, "I've been watching Mark and Sarah for years now, seeing the way he's treated her. He's such a kind and thoughtful man." Linda's gaze lingered on Sarah as she spoke, her words carefully chosen. "I always admired how much love he showed you, Sarah. Honestly, I envied you. I've even fantasized about being in your shoes." Linda paused, letting her words hang in the air before continuing. "The way he transformed himself for you, losing 118 pounds to make you happy, that's the kind of man any woman would dream of having in her life." Her voice softened as she added, "And now I'd give anything for a chance with him." At precisely 4 p.m., Mark stepped onto the pool deck, his timing impeccable. He greeted Sarah and the women with a knowing smile, his eyes scanning the scene. "Looks like everyone's getting some great tans," he remarked playfully. Turning his attention to the three women, he added, "You're all looking fantastic. You might make it hard for me to concentrate." His tone was teasing, but Sarah could sense the underlying tension. Mark turned to Sarah and quipped, "What about you? Why haven't you joined in?" Sarah, already upset by the afternoon's events, reluctantly removed her top to avoid further conflict, her movements tense and hesitant. Once the banter settled, Mark's expression turned serious. He fixed his gaze on Sarah and said, "I have 2 questions for you, and I need you to be completely honest." The weight of his tone silenced everyone. "First, have you ever cheated on me during our marriage?" Sarah, her voice trembling, firmly denied any infidelity. Mark's eyes narrowed. "What about Tony from the gym?" he pressed. Sarah, visibly shaken, maintained her denial, feigning confusion about the accusation. "Where is this coming from?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Mark didn't flinch. "I'm talking about the regular Wednesday mornings and those Friday afternoons when I was golfing." Care to explain? Despite his detailed knowledge of her actions, Sarah stuck to her denial, hoping he didn't have solid proof. Brenda, Sally, and Linda exchanged knowing glances, their expressions a mix of amusement and anticipation. Mark calmly began laying out the evidence. He described the patterns in her phone records, highlighting the frequency and timing of her calls to Tony. "I even had Brenda confirm that the number belongs to Tony," he added. Although he didn't have photographic proof, Mark made it clear that the circumstantial evidence left little room for doubt. Sarah's face drained of color as the full extent of Mark's knowledge hit her. She realized that their relationship was teetering on the edge of collapse. As she tried to muster a response, Mark held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said firmly. "There's nothing you can say to convince me otherwise." Mark admitted that despite his deep love for Sarah, his current emotions, hurt, disgust, and anger, far outweighed any lingering affection. "This isn't just about the affair," he said. "It's about the complete disregard you've shown for our relationship and for me." Turning to the 3 women, Mark introduced them properly. "Sally here has been a colleague and a good friend for years. I've always known about her feelings for me, but I respected my marriage too much to act on them." Sally smiled warmly, appreciating his honesty. Next, Mark gestured to Linda. "Linda's someone I've gotten to know during our visits to Grisham's. She's seen firsthand how much I've tried to make this marriage work." Linda nodded, her admiration for Mark evident in her gaze. Linda, with a playful yet sincere tone, admitted she had fantasized about being with Mark for years, her admiration for him growing with every kind gesture he showed to Sarah. Mark, appreciating Linda's openness, smiled warmly and complimented her, particularly praising her figure and, with a touch of humor, specifically her chest. He added that he was looking forward to exploring a deeper connection with Linda, emphasizing how her admiration had lifted his spirits during such a difficult time. Turning to Brenda, Mark introduced her as a compassionate and resourceful bartender who had stepped up to help him when he was at his lowest. He recounted how Brenda had supported him not only emotionally but also practically, assisting him in uncovering the truth about Sarah. Brenda grinned, clearly proud of her role, but also remained focused on the gravity of the situation. Meanwhile, Sarah sat silently, teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Her tears flowed freely, her breathing uneven, as if she were struggling to find the words to say. Her lips moved as if to speak, but no sound came. Mark, noticing her state, addressed her calmly but firmly. "Sarah, I know this is overwhelming, but your actions over the past 2 years have left me no choice. I have to move forward." Mark then turned back to the women, acknowledging the interest they had expressed in him and his own anticipation of exploring these new connections. However, he reiterated his firm stance against infidelity. "I've never been unfaithful to you, Sarah," he said, his tone resolute. "But to pursue any of these relationships, I need to end our marriage." It's the only way I can move forward without breaking the promises I've made. At that moment, Brenda reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers. Sarah, she said gently but firmly, these are your divorce papers. She explained that in addition to her work as a bartender, she was also a licensed process server and was delivering the documents on Mark's behalf. Sarah, overwhelmed by the delivery, broke into sobs. Through her tears, she apologized profusely, insisting that she loved Mark and begging him to reconsider. Mark, unmoved, shook his head. Sarah, if you truly loved me, how could you do this? Not just once or twice, but over 100 times. His voice cracked with a mix of anger and sadness. This isn't just about a mistake. It's about a pattern of betrayal. He informed her that the court hearing was scheduled for the following Friday and that after their legal separation, he planned to explore his new relationships. Maybe, he said, indulging in these new connections will help me understand why you chose Tony and what satisfaction you found with him. Perhaps I'll even find the love and support I thought I had with you. Turning to Brenda, Sally, and Linda, Mark thanked them for their presence and support, but indicated it was time for them to leave. I'll be in touch with each of you, he said warmly. After seeing them off, Mark went inside to pack a few belongings, preparing to stay at a hotel until Friday, when one of them would officially move out. When Mark reemerged, suitcases in hand, he approached Sarah, who was still seated by the pool, her head in her hands. She looked up at him, unsure of what more he could possibly say. Mark's expression was unreadable as he leaned in slightly. Sarah, I warned you about the consequences for your lover, he began. It turns out Tony moved on pretty quickly. When you canceled on him, he started something with his blonde gym coworker, Gina Margarella. Mark paused for a moment, letting the name sink in. Gina, as it happens, is married to Gino Margarella. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as Mark continued. Gino didn't take kindly to Tony's actions. Let's just say Tony won't be smiling anytime soon. He's got a busted face, broken ribs, and a few missing teeth. And thanks to Gino, it's doubtful Tony will ever be able to engage in activities like that again. Mark added, almost as an afterthought, I may have gotten in a shot or two myself, but don't worry, I've got an alibi. It was my golf day after all. Straightening up, Mark looked down at Sarah one last time. I hope you have a great life, Sarah, he said, his tone final. I'll see you in court next Friday. Left alone by the pool, Sarah sobbed quietly, her world unraveling. Within the next 2 hours, she packed her belongings and left for her mother's house, her despair deepening with every step. The divorce process stretched over 7 months, during which Sarah sank into a profound depression. Mark, contrary to his earlier words about the 3 women, chose not to pursue those relationships. Instead, he found solace in simpler, more meaningful companionship. 2 golden retrievers who provided him with the unconditional love he had always longed for. Through them, Mark discovered a new sense of peace and ultimately realized what true, unwavering love felt like.